My brother walked across the stage in his cap and gown, shaking hands with professors while cameras flashed. Everyone clapped like he was the second coming of Einstein. Dad leaned over to a family friend and said, loud enough for me to hear, "Stanford, my son, the future of our brand." Then his eyes slid past me like I wasn't even standing there. I was 24, grease under my nails, wearing the only suit I owned. While my brother was collecting diplomas, I was collecting busted carburetors and late-night repair orders in a garage 2 blocks from the highway. To Dad, that made me a disappointment. A kid who never lived up to the Mercer name. My brother, Thomas, was the star. I was the shadow. At the graduation party, Dad stood at the head of the room, champagne glass in hand, and made the announcement I knew was coming. Thomas will be stepping into leadership of Mercer Automotive, our family's $100 million brand. Applause erupted, glasses clinked, my mother wiped a proud tear. I stood in the back, invisible, my drink warm in my hand. No mention of me. No glance my way. Just silence where a son should have been acknowledged. I didn't storm out. I didn't argue. That wasn't my way. Instead, I sank deeper into the background, watching as guests lined up to shake Thomas's hand, to praise his brilliance, to tell Dad how lucky he was. I waited, quiet, my expression blank. But inside, something sharp was forming. It was then that a stranger appeared beside me. Middle-aged, sharp suit, eyes that studied rather than celebrated. He extended his hand, firm and deliberate. When I shook it, he slipped something into my palm, a folded letter. Leaning closer, he whispered, "Your time starts now." Then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd before I could ask who he was. I unfolded the letter under the table. Inside was a single sentence. "Meet me at the corner of 5th and Ash, 10 p.m. tonight. Bring nothing. Trust no one." I sat still, the noise of the party fading into a dull roar. For the first time that night, my pulse quickened. Not because Dad had chosen my brother. That was predictable. But because someone else had chosen me. I slipped the letter into my jacket pocket and lifted my glass, pretending to toast with the others. Outwardly, I was calm, detached, another background figure in Thomas's spotlight. Inwardly, I was calculating. Quietly, I understood. Something had shifted. When the party ended and my brother basked in the glow of his new empire, I walked alone into the night, the words echoing in my head. "Your time starts now." At 10 sharp, I stood on the corner of 5th and Ash, the city buzzing around me, but feeling strangely distant. A line of taxis idled at the curb, neon lights flickered from a bar across the street, and the hum of late-night traffic filled the silence. I kept my hands in my pockets, letter folded tight, eyes scanning for the stranger from the party. He emerged from the shadows like he'd been waiting all along. Same sharp suit, same measured steps, same eyes that cut straight through me. He didn't waste time on greetings. He simply motioned for me to follow. I did. We walked 3 blocks without a word before he ducked into a side alley and opened a door I never knew existed. Inside was a dimly lit office, walls lined with old photographs of factories, race cars, and blueprints that looked older than my father. The air smelled of oil and dust, but also of history. He finally spoke. His voice was calm, deliberate. He said he had known my grandfather, the real architect of the Mercer brand. Not the man my father bragged about in speeches, but the one who built the company from a single garage with his own hands. He said my grandfather had always intended for the company to pass to someone who understood machines, not just balance sheets. Someone who lived grease, not just profits. That someone, he claimed, was me. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, silent, my pulse steady. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents I wasn't supposed to see, shareholder agreements, trust provisions, and letters my grandfather had written before he died. Letters that spoke of legacy, integrity, and a warning. The brand would collapse in the hands of those who cared more for image than substance. The stranger leaned back and studied me. He said my father had chosen Thomas because Thomas was easy to display, polished enough for boardrooms. But the board itself, the men and women who had built fortunes alongside my grandfather, had doubts. They were watching. They were waiting for proof that the right heir still existed. I sat there, silent, flipping through the pages, each one heavier than the last. My grandfather's handwriting stared back at me, sharp and certain. His words weren't filled with sentiment. They were instructions, challenges, demands. Build. Protect. Lead. The stranger placed a single key on the table. It was old, brass, worn from decades of use. He said it opened a workshop my grandfather had kept hidden from the public, a place where prototypes and designs were stored. A place no one but the rightful heir would know how to use. He looked me in the eye and repeated the same words from the party. Your time starts now. I left the office with the key heavy in my pocket, the folder pressed under my arm, and my mind sharper than it had been in years. My father had chosen Thomas. But my grandfather had chosen differently, and I knew which choice carried more weight. The workshop sat on the edge of town, hidden behind a rusted gate that looked abandoned to anyone passing by. The key fit the lock like it had been waiting for me all along. The hinges groaned as I pushed open the heavy door, dust spilling into the night air. Inside, the silence was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was alive, like the walls still carried the hum of engines long gone. I flicked on the light. The room stretched wide, lined with covered shapes. Dusty tarps hid what I guessed were cars, machines, maybe even prototypes no one had seen in decades. Tools hung neatly on the walls, untouched but sharp, like my grandfather had set them down yesterday. The air smelled of oil, leather, and something older. History, maybe, or legacy. I walked slowly, pulling the covers off one by one. A streamlined racer from the 1960s. A muscle car that looked like it had never seen daylight. Designs ahead of their time. Shapes that whispered of speed and strength. Each vehicle carried his fingerprints, his vision, his refusal to compromise. They weren't just machines, they were statements. On the workbench sat a thick binder, cracked with age. Inside were blueprints, sketches, and handwritten notes. Margins filled with equations, reminders, warnings. One page caught my eye. It was labeled simply, Next. The design looked like nothing Mercer Automotive had ever produced. Sleek, efficient, a machine that balanced raw power with precision. My grandfather's handwriting beside it read, For the one who understands, not just inherits. I stood there, staring at those words. Thomas could memorize business plans, charm investors, and wear a suit better than anyone. But this language of steel and torque, of gears and combustion, this was mine. I had lived it in the garage, under fluorescent lights, with busted engines and scraped knuckles. Dad called it a dead-end skill. My grandfather called it the future. I spent hours in that workshop, cataloging, photographing, memorizing. Every note, every sketch, every design. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Mercer Automotive wasn't meant to be a brand for shareholders. It was meant to be a legacy for builders. My father had turned it into a stage. My brother would turn it into a spectacle. But my grandfather had designed it to be something else, a fortress of innovation. By dawn, I locked the place again, the key burning hot in my pocket. I walked back through the empty streets, the city waking around me, my path sharp in my mind. I didn't need to tell anyone what I had found. Not yet. The strength was in silence, in preparation, in holding the truth close until the time was right. My father believed he had crowned his heir. My brother believed he had inherited an empire. Both of them were wrong. Because while they celebrated, I had found the one thing neither of them understood. The foundation. The blueprint. The future. And it was mine. I didn't rush back to the workshop the next day. Quiet strategy meant patience, not noise. Instead, I went to the garage where I worked, the same cramped space that smelled of gasoline and burnt rubber. My boss, an old mechanic named Ray, tossed me keys to a busted pickup and grumbled about the transmission. To him, I was just the kid who fixed cars. And that was exactly how I wanted it, for now. While I worked, my mind wasn't on the truck. It was on the binder, on the word next, on the blueprint that had felt like a message sent across decades. My brother was shaking hands with investors, preparing speeches, probably trying on suits for board meetings. I was elbow deep in grease, storing my advantage where no one could see it. That evening, I drove back to the workshop with a notebook of my own. I cataloged each prototype, copying my grandfather's notes by hand, tracing the design language he had left behind. The more I studied, the clearer it became. This wasn't just innovation, it was protection. My grandfather had built redundancy into the family brand, a safeguard hidden in plain sight. If one heir chose vanity, another could step in with vision. I thought about my father's speech at the party, the way he had introduced Thomas as the future. He believed charisma would carry the company. But charisma doesn't turn wrenches. Charisma doesn't understand the growl of an engine or the subtle balance between weight and speed. Mercer Automotive had survived because my grandfather built machines that couldn't be ignored. And now those machines were waiting for me. I made copies of everything. Digital scans uploaded to secure drives, paper notes hidden in places no one would think to look. If Thomas or my father discovered the workshop, they'd find empty space. I wasn't just preparing. I was protecting. The stranger who gave me the key had vanished as quickly as he appeared. No calls, no letters, no instructions beyond that single phrase. Your time starts now. I didn't know who he was aligned with, the board, an old partner, or someone else entirely. But I knew this. He had given me more than a key. He had given me proof that someone was watching, waiting for me to step out of the shadows. Back at the garage, I kept my routine. Fixed cars, wiped my hands, went home. To everyone else, I was still the disappointment. The brother who never left town. The son who never impressed dad. The man who fixed cars while others built empires. But under the silence, something else was moving. A current. A plan. A legacy not yet revealed. My father thought the story was already written. My brother thought he was the lead actor. Neither of them realized they were standing on a stage my grandfather had built for me. And I had no intention of leaving it empty. A month later, my father hosted a gala in the city to celebrate Thomas officially joining the company. It was staged like a coronation, spotlights, champagne fountains, the Mercer name plastered across banners like it was royalty. I wasn't invited, but I showed up anyway. Not as a guest, as staff. I parked cars for the valet service, a rented jacket covering the same calloused hands that had once rebuilt an entire engine by myself. From the valet stand, I watched the parade. Executives, investors, politicians, they all came to shake my brother's hand. Cameras flashed as Dad introduced him to board members, boasting that Thomas was ready to lead Mercer Automotive into the future. They smiled, clapped, believed every word. Not one of them looked twice at the kid jogging back and forth with car keys. But I looked at them, studied them, listened. Quiet observation had always been my advantage. I caught fragments of conversations, concerns about quarterly losses, whispers about the brand falling behind competitors, doubts about Thomas's experience. Behind the polished speeches, there was hesitation. Later that night, as I parked another guest's car, I caught sight of the stranger who had given me the key. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't wave or smile. He just gave a subtle nod, as if to say, "Keep watching." Then he vanished into the crowd, leaving me with more questions than answers. Inside the ballroom, Thomas took the stage. He spoke with confidence, quoting business jargon he barely understood, promising innovation while wearing a suit tailored to perfection. The crowd clapped on cue, but I saw the board members' faces. Some leaned back, arms crossed. Others whispered while he talked. They weren't convinced. I slipped away from the valet stand and circled to the side of the building where service staff took smoke breaks. Through the tall windows, I could see the crowd clearly. My father beamed at Thomas like a king presenting his heir, and Thomas soaked in the attention, unaware of how fragile it all was. That was when I understood the pressure building. My family thought they had secured their future, but the cracks were already showing. The board wasn't blind. The investors weren't deaf. And the louder Thomas spoke, the more hollow his words sounded. I didn't need to interrupt. I didn't need to expose him yet. My time hadn't come. But standing there in the shadows, I realized something vital. Silence was no longer just my shield. It was my weapon. While they burned through their performance, I was gathering proof, preparing for the moment when the right move would shatter the illusion. When the gala ended, I slipped back into the stream of staff leaving through the side door. No one noticed me. No one remembered I was there. But I remembered everything. The pressure was mounting. And soon, silence would break it. The first strike came quietly, the way all strong strikes do. I didn't announce it, didn't warn anyone. I simply sent an envelope. Inside were 3 photocopied blueprints from my grandfather's binder, stamped with his original signature and notes. I mailed it directly to the Mercer Board of Directors. No return address, no explanation. Just proof of innovation they had never seen. Designs their chosen heir couldn't possibly understand. A week later, I read the ripples in the news. An article buried deep in the business section mentioned Mercer Automotive reviewing its long-term research archives. It was vague, cautious, but I recognized the signal. The board was restless. They had seen what I sent. At the garage, I worked like nothing had changed. Fixed brakes, tuned engines, replaced timing belts. Customers came and went, thanking me with handshakes and worn bills. I kept my head down, but inside, I felt the shift. The board now knew there was more to the Mercer legacy than Thomas's polished speeches. They just didn't know who had shown them. That weekend, Dad hosted another dinner, smaller this time, but still staged for investors. I wasn't invited, but word reached me. Thomas had been asked questions he couldn't answer, questions about research, about design, about engineering history. He had stumbled, thrown out buzzwords, but the cracks showed. Dad brushed it off, but I knew what it meant. My silence had landed the first blow. Late that night, I returned to the workshop. I unlocked the door, flipped on the lights, and sat at the workbench with my grandfather's binder. I studied the next design again, tracing the lines with my finger. Every detail spoke of vision beyond its time. And I realized something. This wasn't just a plan for a car. It was a plan for me. Proof that being called a disappointment had never been a curse. It was camouflage. While they dismissed me, I had become the only one capable of carrying the legacy forward. The stranger's words came back to me. Your time starts now. I understood them differently now. Time didn't mean one decisive moment. It meant a series of precise moves, each one quiet, each one calculated, until the truth could no longer be denied. Back at the garage, Ray asked why I'd been staying late. I just shrugged, wiped my hands, and said I liked the quiet. He nodded, never pushing further. He saw only what I allowed him to see. That was the power of silence. It hid preparation until the world mistook it for nothing. My father thought I was still invisible. My brother thought he was untouchable. But the board was beginning to suspect there was more to the Mercer name than the polished speeches of a Stanford graduate. And suspicion was the first crack in the wall. The second strike came not through blueprints, but through numbers. Quiet, undeniable numbers. I compiled financial reports my father never thought I'd see, outdated R&D budgets, dwindling profits, market share graphs sliding downward while competitors surged ahead. My brother was too busy polishing his speeches to notice the cracks. But the board would. I printed copies, highlighted the patterns, and mailed them the same way I had before, anonymous, precise, impossible to trace. A week later, the market reacted. Mercer Automotive's stock dipped 3% after whispers of mismanagement reached investors. It wasn't a collapse, but it was enough to rattle nerves. Enough to make the board glance at Thomas not as a savior, but as a liability. At the next family dinner, word leaked back to me. Thomas had been grilled about numbers he didn't understand, projections he hadn't reviewed. He deflected, tried to charm his way through, but charm doesn't fix balance sheets. Dad grew red in the face, insisting his son was learning, adjusting. But the silence in the room told a different story. The board was losing faith. Meanwhile, I stayed in the garage, head down, working. Ray asked if I'd heard the news about Mercer stock. I shrugged. He didn't know I had caused it. Nobody did. That was the strength of my position. I was invisible, untouchable, moving the pieces without showing my hand. Back at the workshop, I began assembling something more tangible. Using my grandfather's designs, I restored one of the old prototypes, a streamlined racer from the 1960s that still carried his fingerprints. Long nights passed in silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of tools against steel. As I worked, I imagined the day the board would see it, the moment they would realize who truly understood the Mercer legacy. The stranger's absence didn't bother me. His role had been fulfilled. He had given me the key, the spark. The rest was mine to execute. And I was executing with precision. Thomas, on the other hand, was unraveling. Reports reached me that he'd begun snapping at assistants, drinking too much at investor functions, fumbling through press interviews. The pressure I had applied was subtle, but it was enough. He was cracking under the weight of expectations he had never been built to carry. I didn't celebrate. I didn't taunt. I simply worked, storing strength in silence, building evidence in shadows. Every blueprint restored, every document copied, every whisper of doubt planted. It was all part of the same system. My father still paraded Thomas like a trophy. The press still printed glossy photos of the Mercers smiling at galas. But beneath the surface, the story was shifting. The applause was thinning. The confidence was cracking. And I knew it was only a matter of time before silence became undeniable truth. The breaking point came at a press conference meant to showcase Mercer Automotive's vision for the future. My father had arranged the entire event, a sleek stage, glossy banners, reporters lining the aisles with cameras ready. Thomas walked out first, perfectly tailored, smiling with the ease of a man convinced the world belonged to him. He began his speech, polished words about innovation and growth rolling off his tongue. But then came the questions. A reporter asked about the company's lagging research budget. Another pressed him on declining market share. A third asked if Mercer had any new designs in development. Thomas stammered, his eyes darting to Dad for help. He tried buzzwords, the same empty phrases he had rehearsed at dinners and galas, but the crowd wasn't buying it. The murmurs grew louder, the cameras less forgiving. By the time the conference ended, the headlines were already writing themselves. Mercer future in question. Heir unprepared for challenges. Investors lose confidence. I watched it unfold on a small television in the garage, grease still on my hands, the prototype gleaming quietly under a tarp in the corner. At that moment, I understood how fragile power really was. My brother hadn't lost because of a single mistake. He had lost because he was never meant to carry the weight in the first place. All I had done was tilt the stage and let gravity finish the job. Meanwhile, I kept working in silence. Every night, I returned to the workshop, refining my grandfather's design, restoring the prototype piece by piece. The engine roared to life for the first time in decades, a deep, steady growl that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't just a machine, it was proof. Proof of vision. Proof of legacy. Proof that I was not the disappointment they thought I was. The board called an emergency meeting the following week. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. Word spread quickly. They questioned Thomas for hours, demanding answers he didn't have. My father defended him, red-faced, but the silence in the room told the real story. The tide was turning. Back at home, I sat with the binder open on my desk. My grandfather's handwriting stared back at me. For the one who understands, not just inherits. Those words weren't just instructions. They were prophecy. I thought about the stranger who had given me the key, about the quiet nod at the gala. Whoever he was, he knew this was coming. He knew silence would speak louder than speeches, that patience would erode the empire faster than any scandal. And he was right. My brother was collapsing in the spotlight. My father was scrambling to protect him. And I was standing in the shadows, holding the one thing they could never fabricate, the truth. The pressure had reached its peak. And soon, it would break. The board's invitation came in a plain envelope, delivered by courier with no return address. Inside was a single card with the Mercer logo embossed in silver and a time and date written in neat block letters. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. The meeting was held in a private conference room downtown, far from the glossy halls of Mercer headquarters. I walked in wearing the same worn suit from my brother's graduation, my hands clean but scarred from years of engine work. The directors sat around a long table, eyes sharp, voices low. My father was there, red-faced, clenching his jaw. Thomas sat beside him, pale, tired, trying to look confident, but failing under the weight of the silence. They asked me to sit. I didn't speak. I placed a folder on the table and slid it forward. Inside were photographs of my grandfather's prototypes, copies of his blueprints, and notes written in his hand. Pages they had never seen. Designs that proved the Mercer legacy was more than balance sheets and speeches. The room shifted as they studied the documents. Some leaned closer, whispering. Others looked at Thomas, then back at me. My father tried to dismiss it as nonsense, claiming they were fakes, but the directors ignored him. They knew my grandfather's handwriting. They knew authenticity when they saw it. Then I gave them more. A USB drive with video footage of the restored prototype, the engine roaring to life after decades in silence. I didn't narrate. I didn't explain. I just let the sound fill the room. The steady growl of the machine was louder than any words I could have spoken. For the first time, the board looked at me differently. Not as the disappointment, not as the shadow, but as the one who understood. Thomas shifted in his seat, his hand trembling against the table. He tried to speak, to argue, but his voice cracked. The directors didn't even glance at him. Their focus was on the evidence, on the proof laid out in front of them. I sat still, my hands folded, my breathing even. This was the moment I had prepared for, but I didn't gloat. I didn't push. Silence was enough. The documents and the machine spoke louder than anything I could have said. Finally, one of the directors leaned back and said quietly, We need to reconsider succession." The words dropped like a stone into the silence. My father slammed his fist against the table, but no one reacted. His authority no longer held weight. I stood, nodded once, and gathered the folder. The meeting ended without ceremony, but the shift was permanent. Walking out of that room, I understood something my father never would. Power doesn't come from claiming the spotlight. It comes from owning the foundation. And I had just placed it in plain view. The decision wasn't announced in headlines or press releases. It happened in silence, the way most real power shifts do. The board began moving quietly, consolidating influence, limiting my father's control, pulling Thomas out of meetings without explanation. I didn't ask questions. I didn't celebrate. I just kept showing up when they called, each time with more evidence, more precision, more of my grandfather's legacy in hand. Within months, Thomas was sidelined. His title still read heir apparent, but the real decisions no longer passed through him. My father raged, called in favors, threatened, but his voice had lost its weight. The board had seen the truth, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. One evening, I was asked to return to the same downtown conference room. The directors were already seated, papers spread before them. My father wasn't there this time. Neither was Thomas. They asked me a simple question. Was I willing to step forward, not with speeches or appearances, but with results? I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hang, steady and deliberate, until the weight of it filled the room. Then I nodded once. That was all. They handed me a new folder. Inside were contracts, plans for restructuring, outlines of projects that had been stalled for years. At the top, in bold letters, was a title I never expected to see beside my name: Interim Director of Research and Development. It wasn't the crown my father had placed on Thomas's head. It was something heavier, something real. I left the meeting with no fanfare, no applause. Just the city night pressing close, the sound of traffic rolling by. In my pocket, the same brass key that had started it all pressed against my leg, warm from the heat of my hand. My time had started the moment that stranger handed me the letter, but now it had shape. Now it had teeth. At home, I unlocked the workshop again. The prototype sat gleaming under the lights, restored to its full glory. I walked around it slowly, fingertips brushing the steel. My grandfather had built machines that carried his name beyond his lifetime. Now it was my turn to carry them further. I thought of Thomas, sitting somewhere in silence of his own, stripped of the empire he thought was guaranteed. I thought of my father, furious at losing control of the brand he believed he owned. And I thought of the stranger, the man who had slipped me a letter and changed everything with 4 words. Your time starts now. He had been right. My time had started not when the board gave me a title, but when I chose silence over rage, preparation over noise. My family called me the disappointment who fixed cars. But in the end, the disappointment rebuilt the future. And I did it without ever raising my voice. Been through it. When they crossed a line, and you made sure they felt it.